Good morning and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the questions section of the Go To webinar menu and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I'd like to welcome everybody to the June 8th edition of Crop Talk. And this week's Crop Talk, we're going to have Kim Brown on Livingston, and she's going to be talking about fresh out of the ACC Weed ID class in Brandon last week. She'll be giving us an update on some. I asked her about some of the weeds that are maybe a little bit harder to identify, or ones that look similar to other ones, and it would be kind of good to go over something like that. So Kim was able to put some stuff together, and she'll be with us today. Then from there, we're going to go to our crop scouting panel, and there's been a few questions coming in, and questions that I guess we're having this year because of the growing season and because of the lateness and just the fact that producers are trying to do so many things at one time. I think that's starting to cause a few issues as well. So, but before we get into Kim's presentation, I'd like to put up some information from our crop report that goes out on a weekly basis now. And when we finished off last week's webinar, I was hoping that we would be in that 70% as we got into this week's webinar, and we're close. We're around 65% complete, and that's province-wide. So there's definitely areas that are a lot higher than that, and there's definitely areas that are still lower than that. And I think that's pretty common when you see where some of the recent weather storms hit. Some of those producers, especially in the southeastern part of the province and the eastern side of the province, are just nicely getting going after that last rainfall event. And some of the guys on the western side of the province have been going for pretty good for the last 4 or 5 days here. I've been back in the field, and one of the things I've seen in some of my travels is exactly how much can get done in a short period of time. There's now when you drive by fields, there looks like the majority of them are sown or something's been done to them. So I think we're definitely getting the crop in fast, and I think the weather forecast for the next 4 to 5 days anyways isn't calling for a whole bunch of rain if it is. So I think we definitely could be getting close to getting a lot of the crop in. By the end of next week, we should be getting close. So which would be nice to see. I wanted to put this up because this is something that I think a lot of producers need to keep in mind, and this is our seeding deadlines. So if you're, there's been a lot of talk lately about changing crops around, and growing, crops that were designated for these fields are now going to be changed into something else. And I think just a reminder of the updates within the deadlines, and probably the best thing to do if you have any questions regarding your seeding deadlines for your area, a quick call into your local MASC office or your Ag Service Center would be a good option. But this chart here basically shows that a lot of the seeding deadlines are fast approaching, and we need to keep seeding and getting that crop in. So again, I think we're going to be good. I think for a lot of the crop, I think remaining, a lot of the cereals I think are in or close to being in, besides some of the feed grains. And canola is the one that's being planted fairly fast right now, and we get to get 100% coverage. We have till June 15th in most areas, and then June 10th in area 2 again. So again, if you're in one of those the area 2, just make sure you know what your deadlines are there. And there's also the extending seeding deadlines as well. So So with that, that's just a brief update of kind of where seeding is and where we are right now. And I would like to turn it over to Kim now, and we're going to talk weeds and some of the some of the best ways to identify some of these weeds. So Kim, if you're on, we'll pass over the screen to you.
Yeah, I'm actually using Marla's computer because mine had some issues this morning. So
Yeah.
can you see my presentation now?
You bet. Just go into slideshow and would be perfect.
Okay, hang on.
Great.
Just changing my pointer. There we go. Okay, so, thanks very much, Lionel. I've been getting lots of questions in from people, and of course, this is the time of year that weeds are showing up, and we are seeing a lot of weed growth compared to the last couple of years. We've had a couple of really dry springs for most of the province for the last couple of years, so we haven't seen a lot of weed growth. We've had abundant weed growth now. We actually, I think that a lot of guys are managing to keep ahead of it. There's been some tillage going on to help dry out the soils and help get seeding in, so that certainly is helping. But we do have to be careful too. I know there's been some guys caught with, crop in the ground and meant to do a burn off before it came up. That didn't happen. So, that's where we kind of really have to watch these weeds getting ahead of us and to kind of know what's out there, know what your options are. You can look at the burn off tables. A lot of the products in the burn off tables in the guide are, some of them are pre-seeding, some of them are just pre-emergent. So just check your labels and just, talk to your companies and your retails on that, as to which products you can still be using. And then once crop comes up, obviously we're pulling glyphosate out of the mix unless it's a glyphosate tolerant crop. But once our cereals come up, there are still a few options there, and those are again things that we can talk to our retailers about getting out, especially if you're looking at a few weeds like volunteer canola and that type of thing. So having said that, I thought we would just do kind of a real quick weed ID, just a refresher. When we're looking at cereals, we don't have a lot, or grasses, sorry, we don't have a lot to look at when we're trying to identify these teeny tiny little grasses. They are, there's not a lot to look at, but in a way that's a good thing, because then you have to look for very specific things. There's not a lot of differences. So the sheath is here and how it opens or closes, or is it like a close like a V-neck here? Does it overlap? Does it stay open down the stem for quite a while? So when you're reading, if you're looking up something in a weed book, and I think we all have probably lots of different little weed books that we use. I have a couple of go-to books that I have all the time. And they'll talk about, the sheath, overlapping sheath, or the sheath is fused in like a V-neck. Lots of times we hear this term, this V-neck, which is kind of looks like this one here on the right-hand side that I'm circling there. So another thing is these ligules. Now this is this membranous part back here. It can be membranous or it can be a hairy. It's usually there, one of the two, or it's not there at all. So when we look at these ligules, then we talk about, like, is it membranous? Is it a fringe of hairs? And then the shape of it. Sometimes it's very pointed. Sometimes it's extremely jaggedy. If you look at something like a downy brome, it's it's membranous, but really jaggedy. Wild oats is like a kind of like an upside down V. It comes to a real point like in there. So anyways, these are very distinctive characteristics. Because we don't have a lot to look at and they are so distinctive, it actually makes it fairly easy for grass identification. So here's just a little picture here. Like this is the leaf blade or the lamina. This is the ligule in here. These auricles come in here. This is the sheath that that wraps around the stem, and the stem is sometimes called the culm. And sometimes too, we do talk about the collar, which is the back part, basically behind the ligule, like kind of in the back part of the leaf here. Anyways, and I'll talk about that. I think I've got a picture or two to show you of that. Sometimes that is like angled, it's on a slant. Sometimes it looks like a bow tie. So you'll sometimes see that in some books if you're trying to figure out what some of these small grasses are. Again, here's auricles. Now these are these appendages that I always think they look like little arms. They kind of clasp. So if you're thinking barley, you can just look down at the ground at barley and you can see the great big auricles are usually quite white looking. These are probably wheat in here. They're a little bit smaller and they're colored. I know different wheat varieties have different colored oracles, and I know, you know, when I was scouting wheat that was midge tolerant wheat, you could pick out the refuge in there just based on the different colored oracles. They were quite red, quite dark compared to the main variety of wheat in that mix. And then here is a picture where, you know, there's nothing at all. There's nothing. So here there's claw-like, there's rounded, there's not fully developed, there's absent altogether. Some grasses have absolutely nothing. And I guess so you would think something like a barnyard grass on one extreme has nothing versus something like a volunteer barley, which has really, really big, very noticeable oracles. So this is a good table that to use, and it talks about some of the weeds. Again, we're talking volunteers here, volunteer wheat, volunteer barley, and volunteer oats. So here the sheaths are split, then the ligule membranous, the oracles are small and there's hairs on them. There's usually lots of little fine hairs on them. The plant itself is not hairy, but sometimes there is hairs on the leaves, especially right by the oracles and where it attaches on the sheath. And the life cycle here, it's an annual. Barley, very similar, other than the oracles are large and clasping. Oats is a split sheath, a membranous ligule, and nothing at all, no oracles at all. Wild oat, very much the same. Very hard to tell them apart. You have to dig them up, take a look at the seed. It's quite noticeable there. A lot of times too, with a lot of these grasses, the seed stays on for a very, very long time. So you can dig that up and you can find the seed, and it makes it easy to identify them. When you're looking at getting to your foxtails, it's a split sheath. The ligule there is a fringe of hairs. There's no oracles, and it's an annual, but with yellow foxtail, we see those long, silky, pubescent hairs on yellow foxtail, and very noticeable. Barnyard grass is a split sheath. There's no ligule and there's no oracles. There's nothing at all. And when you look at it, it's often very shiny looking inside. And I've got some pictures to show you in a minute. When we're looking at downy and Japanese brome, and you know, we see these are really difficult weeds to control, and we do know now that there's some glyphosate resistance showing up in these weeds, so we have to be really careful with these when we see them. They're very hairy. In general, very soft hairs all over them. They have a V-neck on them, so the sheath is not split. It's quite noticeable that this V-neck, it has a membranous ligule, no oracles, and that's a winter annual. Foxtail barley, it's overlapping, it's membranous, there's no oracles. And then quackgrass actually looks, to me, it actually looks, other than the sheath is a little bit different, but it actually looks quite a bit like wheat. But when you dig it up, obviously you can see the root underneath it, or the rhizomes. But it can look a little bit like wheat when you first see small plants, and if you can't see that root system, because the oracles are very similar. So this is an older picture. It's from one of my predecessors, and it's a little blurry, but it's very good. And not to read it out, but just to show you the differences in, like, you know, there's all kinds of differences here from one plant to another. And so you really only have a couple of things to look at in a grass, but they can be also very different. It actually makes identification quite easy. So, and here, again, when we look at this slide here, and this is our barley, our wheat, and our oats. So these would be these would be our volunteer. When they're in our crop, they're volunteer, and they're volunteer. Then we consider them weeds, obviously. But again, barley, you see these big oracles. Wheat, they're just little. Wild oats has none, and then the ligule is different in all of them as well. So again, we're looking in here. Sometimes we see these fine hairs, this collar. Here you can see it's quite in behind. It's quite big and thick. But again, this is basically where we're looking. We have to pull up these weeds and look at them. I always dig them up as well, because even if it's moist out, which our soils are quite moist right now, even if you will pull apart the structures when you pull them out. So you really need to have a small trowel with you, or like a seed depth checker, like those nice metal ones that you use for soybeans and peas and things like that, and corn. They're very good, but it really is good to have a trowel, because you can see the weed seeds, and no matter how wet it is, you do end up breaking things off when you pull them up. So always be digging stuff up. When you're looking here, when I'm looking at this, we can't always go by color. Oftentimes we'll say, oh, you know, it can be red at the base. Maybe it's a dark green or versus a lighter green. That doesn't always work with color, just because that can be changed based on light intensity. That can change based on, you know, fertility in the soil, that type of thing. And even this red color, like here, lots of times our green foxtails or green and yellow foxtail and our barnyard grass, they can be really, really red at the base, and they're very flat feeling too if you feel them, but they're not always. So you can't go by color. And just looking at this one from the top, you know, we're really not sure which one it is. So you've got to start pulling them apart, and you have to start pulling these leaves off. Again, they can be quite flat looking. They can have red coloring. This one doesn't have anything, but just looking at that without being able to pull those leaves apart, we can't see. So basically we just look in this area, we pull this top leaf back, and again, this is barnyard grass. It's kind of got this big white collar. When you look at it from behind, it's big and white looking, and it's very, there's nothing here. There's no auricles, no ligule, and it's really shiny looking inside. And here, these are some pictures that I took last year. So I'm always digging up. This is just from top down. I knew it was some type of foxtail or barnyard grass. And when I dig it up and I take a look in here, I can see it's quite shiny. There's no auricle, no ligule, but the seed on barnyard grass and on the millets, on the foxtail, stays attached for quite a while. And when you see here, and you see there's a bit of a spine here, and it's kind of a rough looking seed, that's a barnyard grass seed. And these do stay attached for quite a few leaves anyways. So if you're digging up, and be gentle, because it's, you know, the root system's small, you can pretty much always see what weed or what seed this weed came from, and that really helps with the grasses. So when we go into broadleaf, there's a lot more broadleaves, and they're a lot different. They look a lot different from one another. So it's just you just have to know some of the characteristics and kind of be able to put them in families and group them together and kind of eliminate things, try to figure out what some of these weeds are. So I'm going to go through some of the basics and then some of the ones that we've been seeing this year, just because it's been so wet and some strange things are showing up. So I really like the Weeds of Quebec. It's a nice little coil-bound guide. This is just I've taken a scan out of it. They've got kind of a nice little guides in there, basically talking about what the seedlings are like and what the cotyledons are like, and then how you, how you break it down from there. And they have several pages of these, and it's a nice little guide. So if anybody's looking to pick up a guide, the Weeds of Quebec is very nice. It's quite reasonably priced. I think it's under $25. And it has most of the weeds that we have here. There's a few that they don't have in Eastern Canada that they just don't have the same weeds there that we have. In fact, I don't think kochia's in that guide at all. And then there's obviously some weeds from there that we don't have, but it's still a very good guide, and it covers, the majority of what we need to be looking at. And it's a nice guide to keep in the truck. So when we're looking at the mint family, there's a couple here: American dragonhead and hemp nettle. Easy to confuse. I don't know that it would really matter. I think you would be controlling them the same way. So, control it as if it's hemp nettle. But basically here, mint families have square stems and opposite leaves. So you can kind of twirl that stem between your finger and your thumb, and you can feel it's quite square. And then, but then you start looking, and the leaves are opposite. So one pair will come out, and then the next pair comes out at 90 degrees to the first pair. So they come out opposite each other, and then they'll be very neat and orderly all the way up the stem. So here, though, you look at the veins, and the veins in here, if they go into the tooth, the tip of the tooth here, then that's American dragonhead. And if the veins go into the notch, which is this little notch in here, then that's hemp nettle. And I think hemp nettle has an N in it, and I think notch, and that's how I remember it. Nettle, the veins go to the notch. That's really, and otherwise they look very similar. Sometimes the leaves are a little bit more rounded, and sometimes they're quite sharp and pointy, like a mint leaf, like you'd think of a mint leaf. But again, you look at that venation pattern. And here, this is a picture that Lionel sent me of American dragonhead. And if you actually look at these big main veins, and if you follow my pointer, and I follow this one right up here, it goes into the tip, not in the notch. So it goes into the tip on those little serrations on that leaf. So that would be American dragonhead. And it's getting to have some leaves on it by now, because there's a couple down here, and then here's your next leaf pair here, and then your next leaf pair is going to come out here. So yeah, these are starting to get pretty big already. When we're looking at the composite family, this is a big family. It can look quite similar to the borage family, because some of these in this family can be quite hairy. This here is Canada fleabane, and this is one that we really do have to be watching. It is glyphosate resistant, and it's got some resistance issues in places all around us, but not here in Manitoba yet. So we're pretty lucky. It sometimes can be really round looking. I've seen this a few times, not a lot, but this will fool you. But lots of times, just look for these little notches right here in that upper third of the leaf. They're in all these leaves. They just have these little notches, like right this leaf here. You can kind of see them. And it is a soft, hairy plant. It can be quite a bit like borage. Sometimes the borage leaves are they're folded. They're almost like they're folded along that midline, but they're very different looking. And I find a lot of the borage, I don't know which insect it is, and maybe Gavlovsky will know. I'm sure he'll know because he knows everything about bugs. But I find a lot of the borage species in the spring have a lot of shot holing in them. Something is eating them. So I see some of these species get a lot of holes in them, whereas I don't tend to see that when I'm looking at Canada fleabane. So that's just another clue. Anyways, there's that was bluebird. There's also stickseed is another one that in the borage family. Now we're seeing a fair bit of cocklebur this year. This is a kind of really big, long cotyledons, almost shiny looking, very fleshy looking, and cocklebur gets really big really fast. And lots of times though, for clues, you can see the burrs on the ground. Where they've fallen from the plant the year before. So, but it is a big seedling when you do see it, and it gets really big really quick. This is biennial wormwood. And so in here, lots of times here, we see these backward pointing notches on these first leaves. The first true leaves are quite almost entire, which means they're not serrated, they're not rough and jaggedy at all, but they do have these backward pointing notches, and then they start to get divided very quickly. So this is a better picture probably. And so by the time you get past these first couple of true leaves, you start to get really, really finely divided. Now, some people do confuse this with ragweed. Now this picture's a bit blurry here, but this is ragweed on the left-hand side. Ragweed is similar, but it's not as pointy. The tips of all of these leaves and these parts of the leaves, they're much more rounded, whereas biennial wormwood is very, very sharp and pointy. Also too, if you crush biennial wormwood, to me, there's quite an odor, like a sagey type odor, and it's almost an oily smell to it. So that's how I identify it, and I find that works for me, but that might not work for everybody. But a lot of times too, this biennial wormwood, and it is a biennial, but it can be acting as an annual as well. So it's kind of a funny one, and it can be kind of hard to get out of crops. So just to be on the watch out. With it being so wet, we're seeing lots of biennial wormwood, and we're seeing lots of ragweed too. This is false ragweed. There is actually tiny little cotyledons under here, but lots of times the first leaves, the false ragweed have a stalk. They have this, and sometimes people will refer to this as a stalked cotyledon, but there actually are cotyledons down underneath. They're pretty tiny, and then you start to get the more lobing on the leaves once you get past these first couple of true leaves. This is just a shot with a whole bunch of other weeds in it. There's lots of stuff in here to identify. A little bit of flaxweed down here, some grasses, and some dandelion, a little bit of everything in this picture. But again, lots of false ragweed coming up. Seeing some prickly lettuce this year. It does really well. It really likes the moisture. So this one's super easy. If it kind of looks like a dandelion or sow thistle, if you run your finger along the bottom spine, there's this little row of prickles. And I apologize, this is a bit blurry. I just took it with my camera last night, and it was really windy, so I couldn't get a good shot. But you can feel them. They're not sharp, but you can feel these little row of spines. And anyways, and there is a fair bit of that, starting to see that in fields, but I think it's fairly easy to control. You would just treat it like a sow thistle or something. So seeing loads of buckwheat this year too. So buckwheat, anything in this family, we're looking at this ochrea here at the nodes. The cotyledons might be at 120 degrees to each other. Most cotyledons are at 180 degrees across. They're right straight across. But sometimes the things in the buckwheat family have cotyledons on a 120 angle, but not always, so you can't always go by that. So smartweed or lady's thumb is something that we're starting to see a lot of, and it starts out really tiny, and you're not sure what it is, and it gets really big really fast. And so again, here, those cotyledons there might be at that 120. Here they are down here. You can see you don't always get this thumbprint, and you usually don't get it right away. So lots of times it's a fairly inconspicuous looking plant for the first few leaves, and then all of a sudden it starts to get really big. Curled dock is in that family as well. and in the buckwheat family as well. And we are seeing a lot of that this year. And that's a wet weed. It just shows up when it's wet, and it'll show up in places that you've never seen it before just because the fields are wet. So it's a perennial actually, but it will show up. You'll see the seedlings show up. And so it's got these really crinkly edges to the leaves like this. So when it does get big, it has this monster tap root on it. But in our field crops, we shouldn't see it like that if we've got any kind of cultivation going on. Again, and here's wild buckwheat. Lots of times too with wild buckwheat, when it first comes up, this first leaf is like a little stick that just kind of unrolls itself from the bottom, and then and so you can see that, and here you see that here too. That leaf, this first leaf is out. There's those cotyledons on that bit of an angle, and then there's that leaf. It just comes out like a little stick and starts to unroll. There's that ochrea again. Cleavers, I'm sure we're going to see more cleavers this year than we have in a while because it's been quite dry, and they don't do as great in the dry periods, but they really like it wet. So we'll have to be on the lookout for these. These have a square stem as well. Not many species have a square stem. So if you've got a plant with a square stem that pretty much is a mint or a cleaver or something like that. It's got whorled leaves, so those leaves they come from one point here on the stem. There'll be like a space on the stem, and then there'll be a whole bunch of these leaves come right here. And the leaves usually, when it starts off small, it could maybe almost look like a chickweed. You kind of got to be careful, but you do get these little prickles right on the ends of the leaves. So once you get one or two whorls on it, you know what it is. And it's usually fairly low growing. It's prostrate, and then it climbs on whatever it gets on top of, or whatever it can get onto to get on top of. But normally it starts off pretty small, and again, maybe not the easiest to see because it's growing kind of prostrate on the ground. Now the goosefoot family, the Chenopodiaceae, these may accumulate salts. They have goosefoot shaped leaves. They may or may not have reddish colorations, may or may not have stripy stems. So I find a lot of times they do have that stripy stem that's red or purpley and very distinctive, but sometimes it's green stripes and it's just two different colors of green. And they have non-petaled flowers, so the flowers are fairly inconspicuous. And of course, we've got our good friend here, kochia, which we have seen, in the past couple of years because we had our salinity issues were increasing with the dry weather and with the water that's supplying our crops was, coming to the surface from below, we were using up our subsoil moisture. When that happens, it brings all the salts back up with it that had previously, been flushed down. So we've had a lot of rain. We're hoping, that some of those salts would have been pushed a little bit further down in the profile. But again, depending on how the rainfall goes during the season and whether that water moves up or down, it brings the salts with it. So we see a lot of these plants in the last few years, things like kochia and foxtail barley were on the rise just simply because, we had poor competition, poor crop growth because of the drought, and increasing salinity because of the drought. And so plants like this thrive. So we've seen a carpet of these things come up this spring. Now, how well they will survive, I don't know. As long as we get a good competitive crop going too, that's going to help. But we also know too that we have, if you have kochia, it's probably group 2 resistant. We just assume it's all group 2 resistant. Starting to see a lot more glyphosate resistant everywhere here. So, and to test for glyphosate resistance, we know that we can use our PSI lab in Winnipeg. They will do free testing for farmers, and you can send samples in on green kochia so you can get the answer in season. So that is something that we need to be taking advantage of to, determine whether or not the kochia is glyphosate resistant or not. Starting to see some other resistances show up as well, some different group 4 fluroxypyr and dicamba resistant kochia as well. So, those are things that we will be that are being tested for as well. But the glyphosate resistance can be tested by a farmer sending in the samples to Winnipeg, and that's a really good service. And I urge everyone to take advantage of that so we know where we're at with kochia. Lamb's quarters, yeah, there's a ton of lamb's quarters up, and they get really big really fast too. Like it doesn't take long to get this stuff into the 6 or 8 leaf stage. And so lots of times, again, we see with lamb's quarters, we see these little salt secretions here that you can kind of rub off, and they're quite often quite red or purpley looking if you flip them over. It's got some coloration there, but you almost always see this white, this blush on the leaf that you can kind of rub that off with your thumb. When we're looking at the mustard family, they often form rosettes. They have, say, mostly have alternate leaves, although there is a couple there that you may find. They're rare, but they do have opposite leaves, but we probably won't see them, hopefully. And they're not big weeds anyways, but the flowers are distinct. They're 4 petals and 4 sepals, so they're in the shape of a very, very ordered in the shape of a cross. And they usually yellow, but not always. They can be white and they can be pink and they can be a really nice purple as well. If you guys have ever seen Dame's Rocket, that actually is in the canola family. And everything in the mustard family as well will have pods now, and that's another identifying feature later on in its life cycle, obviously, and it's far too late to control it by then, but they all have different pod shapes, and so that's another identifying feature. So this is a picture that Lionel had sent in of flickweed, and seeing a ton of flickweed this year. There's lots of it showing up, and it does get pretty big. It grows in a rosette form, and then it will bolt, and it won't have a lot of leaves on the stem when it bolts. But I have seen some. There is some here around Carmen, like at the research farm, that is bolted already. It obviously was a winter annual, but we are seeing a lot more flickweed this year, if you're wondering what that was. Now, wild mustard, again, we're seeing lots of it. That in most, any of the cotyledons in this, if you're seeing some small plants, and it's, you see something this size, and this true leaf here is hard to tell, but anything in the Brassicaceae family has this kidney-shaped pod, or cotyledon, sorry. It's like shaped like a kidney bean. They're very distinctive. So canola has them, wild mustard has them, all of the different wild mustards, like there's lots, there's dog mustard, there's all kinds of different mustards. But that is a characteristic. This cotyledon is very kidney bean shaped. And so shepherd's purse, again, in that family, and we see these really deeply divided leaves, and they get really lobed. The first few leaves are maybe like something like this one here that my pointer's at. They're not lobed at all. And so, but once you start to get a couple of leaves on this thing, you know pretty quick what it is. Now, it also, though, can look a lot like this marsh yellow cress, and I have seen a lot of this show up already. Marsh yellow cress, though, is in the mustard family, and it only shows up when it's wet, and it'll show up big time when it's wet. It just comes up out of nowhere. And the leaves here, the first few, again, like, same as shepherd's purse, and quite a few of the mustard plants are plants in the mustard family are like this. The first leaves are almost entire or maybe a little bit lobed, and then once you get a few more leaves on the rosette, they really, really change, and they get really deeply lobed, and these lobes will come all the way back to the stem. And marsh yellow cress, though, to me has a bit of a greeny yellow color to it, and I know we said we can't always go by color, but it does tend to have a bit of an off color to it. The same as wild mustard sometimes is a bit more of a yellowy green, whereas a volunteer canola is a bluey green. Again, just if it looks, that's just one thing to help you, but don't go by color. And when it does have pods, they're kind of these funny fat little they're short and fat little pods. They're not like a canola pod at all, so they're quite distinctive. Round leaf mallow, we are seeing so much round leaf mallow this year, and it is getting really big really quick. It's very distinctive heart-shaped cotyledons, but this one's pretty easy to tell because the cotyledons are very different, and then the minute the true leaves come out, there really isn't any other weed we're dealing with that has that leaf shape. We don't see it. Seeing a lot of broadleaf plantain in the wet areas as well this year, and it's quite a fleshy plant. It'll be very low growing, but one thing too, any of these leaves, you can actually pull the leaf off the stem and then just very gently snap that leaf and pull it gently apart, and you see these strings. These strings go all the way up, and you can do it when the leaves get bigger. If you pull the leaves apart, the strings are there too, but it's easier to see if you pull this leaf off the main plant and then just snap it gently and pull, you see those strings, and that's our broadleaf plantain. We're probably going to see some purslane speedwell. I don't have great pictures of it, so I'm hoping to get good pictures. These are from Bugwood, which is a site that you can find pictures and then use them. That's what these numbers are referencing in the bottom here. And I apologize, this one's a bit blurry. Anyways, but they have heart-shaped pods in the stem. That's very distinctive once you see them. Seems to have a very quick life cycle too, but we have seen this thing show up in the wet years. So I'm expecting to see lots of it show up. Northern willow herb is another one that will show up in the wet years, and that's something. This is a pretty good picture of it, and I've seen a little bit of it already this year, so it'll show up. Sometimes it has a bit of a tinge of red to it, A lot of plants in that family do. And anyways, and when it gets bigger, it ends up with these pods that open up. The pods open and split, and they kind of have the fluffy things in them. So it's pretty distinctive later on. But right now, it looks like this. And what else did I have? Yellow nut sedge. I even saw some of this last year in some fields right along the Red River, so I'm expecting there'll be a lot more of it this year. And so it generates from these underground tubers. They're these little nutlets, I think they're called, and it's a sedge. So if we remember that sedges have edges, and it's basically a triangular looking stem. So I think, you know, the guys on the wet soils there, and especially anything along where there's been some overland flooding from a river, then just to be on the lookout for this one. So I'm going to finish up with the amaranth family, because this is something that we always have to be aware of going forward. This is not going away. We have to know what we're doing when we're looking at pigweeds, and we have to know what we could be looking at. There are multiple pigweed species worldwide. In Manitoba, we've had, you know, this one at the top, red root pigweed, for a very long time. It's always been here. It's a crop weed. Seeing a lot of group 2 resistance in there, but, you know, we're able to manage that in our crops with other herbicides and other chemistries. So it isn't really becoming that much of a problem. But there's many amaranth species worldwide that have become glyphosate tolerant, and not just glyphosate tolerant, but tolerant to other chemistries as well. So on our own Noxious Weeds Act, which is an act in Manitoba that protects farmland, we actually have 3 pigweeds that are tier 1 weeds, which means when we find them, they must be destroyed. The smooth pigweed is one that I'm not sure whether we do have some of this in the province already. We did find some last year in quite a few places. It's very hard to tell this one apart from Powell's pigweed. In Manitoba, as far as we know, it has not developed any glyphosate resistance, and we really haven't had that one on our radar too much, but we're definitely going to be looking into that this summer and trying to get a better handle on where that, if that one's here and where it is, and, you know, the characteristics. Now, the good thing is these top 2, red root pigweed and smooth pigweed, they're monoecious, which means they have male and female flowers on the same plant. And that is really good, because water hemp, which is a really bad amaranth, as well as Palmer amaranth, those are dioecious plants, and that means one male, one female, or different male, different female plants. The proportion in the field could be anything, but because of that, they outcross so much more, and the ability of the resistance to spread is so much quicker in a plant that is dioecious and that outcrosses, and so we end up with a lot of genetic diversity, and the resistance traits can spread extremely quickly because of these plants, because of that dioecious nature of them. So these last 2, this tall water hemp and Palmer amaranth, these are probably the number one weed in the US right now. Most people consider that Palmer amaranth. The number 2 weed would be water hemp. Now, these weeds are here, they're on our doorstep. They are also in Southern Ontario, they are in Quebec. Water hemp actually has been naturalized. I'm not sure if it's native, but it definitely had naturalized to Ontario for over 100 years. And for some reason in 2014, it made the jump to glyphosate resistant, and now it's a huge problem in their soybean and corn crops, and it can cause almost complete damage, like up to 97% yield loss when it's uncontrollable in corn. And so that is a huge problem. So we have it on our doorstep. It is a tier 1 weed, which means in Manitoba, tier 1 weeds must be destroyed. They are not allowed to be here. When we find them, they're destroyed. And ideally, we would destroy the weeds without destroying the crop. But there are times that if you can't get that weed out of there, if it's chemical resistant, and we can't spray it out of there, then our options are pulling it. If there's too many to pull out, then probably the best option, the only other option after that, would be mowing it down. You cannot let these things go to seed. They could have up to 1 million seeds, but realistically, in a field situation, several 100,000 seeds per plant, and they spread extremely quickly. So these are weeds that we really have to watch. If you are looking at pigweeds and something doesn't look right, and something looks funny, and you're not sure if it's quite what it is, but you're pretty sure it's a pigweed, then, you know, we need to be investigating these things. And just to show you how difficult it is for some of these things to tell apart, this is from Ontario, or Amafra There's a really great pigweed guide, and I can share it with you guys, or I can tell you where to get it. I've got it as a PDF. And anyways, here is cotyledons on palmer, water hemp, smooth, spiny, red root, and green pigweed. And they're impossible to tell apart. And then even once you get to the 2-leaf stage, this is palmer, this is water hemp, this is smooth pigweed, this is spiny, this is red root, and this is green pigweed. So, I mean, I challenge you to tell at this stage what it is, and even by the time it's 4 or 6 leaf, it's still difficult to tell what kind of amaranth species you are looking at. If it is an amaranth, there's lots of times here in this area here, I find the leaves are a bit lopsided. There's a bit of a notch in there. There is sometimes one hair, like a little spiny hair in there, but lots of the species have that, so you can't use that as a definitive characteristic. There's sometimes a chevron on here, like a V, like you would see on clover. There sometimes has that, but I've also seen that on red root pigweed, and it can be white or it can be purple, and it can be on several different species. So again, that just means it's a pigweed. It does not tell you which one it is. It just means you're looking at a pigweed. So anyways, these are things that we need to be careful of. And again, we can send, if we do find what we suspect to be water hemp or Palmer amaranth, we actually can send that to the PSI lab in Winnipeg for DNA testing to know what species it is. And if we have enough sample, I can also send the samples away to Ontario to a lab there for the resistance testing. So we're able to test these things green. We don't have to wait and gather seeds on them. But as soon as you start seeing something that looks funny, it looks like a pigweed, but it looks funny, we need to get on top of that. We cannot have these plants spread like they have through North Dakota, well, basically through all of the states and in Ontario. I mean, these are capable of you know, putting our row crops out of business pretty much. They're difficult to spray once they're in there because of the chemical resistance, and also in a row crop situation, just because it takes a long time for the rows to close in. You have a lack of crop competition for a very long time, and pigweeds just love that. They thrive under that, in those conditions. The pigweeds have not been doing well in a competitive cereal or canola crop. In the fields where they are a problem in a corn or a soybean or a dry bean, if that field goes to a cereal or canola the next year and that crop's growing really well and gets up quickly and covers the rows, we just don't see the pigweeds anymore. So crop competition is key on this thing, but it's a really big problem. So I think that's the last slide I had. Yes, it is. And so if anybody has questions on that, I'd be happy to take them. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kim. I don't have any questions right now, but just hold on, and you know, as we're going through the panel, there might be something that comes up. Thanks again for doing this. That was a lot of information and a lot of good information. And I think as we get into weed IDing kind of season here and spraying, I think that's kind of a lot of good information and good guides there to help us through that. So thanks for doing that. Aaron, if you could give the screen back to me. Hi, Aaron. Could you give the screen back to me?
You should have it. Is it not working for you?
I got Kim's last slide still.
Okay, let me make Marla a presenter again and try you again. Come free now?
Yes, there it is. Thank you. Okay, we're going to hit into the panel now, and there's been a few questions come in. The first question is going to be for John Hurd, and there's been calls coming in on how to account for soil end losses, in-season nitrogen estimates, and yield potential. So a lot of these calls have been coming into John, so he thought it would be a good opportunity to get that information out to our followers as well. So John, if you want to address this.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. I've decided not to show my slides, but I'll write something up for John Gavlowski's crop pest report. But yes, I'm getting lots of questions, and some people seem to think I've got a crystal ball on these things, but I know the science and I know what we have measured in a few cases. So what we've been doing, we've sampled some fields that were sampled last fall and this spring, and in general across the clay fields, we're down about 30 pounds of nitrogen, or 18% of the nitrate. But on the 2 sandy fields we've been on, we're 65 pounds less nitrogen. 60% of the nitrate has moved. And it isn't lost. We know where it is. It's simply leached. And so that's in the 2 to 4 foot depth. But it's questionable whether the crops are going to tap into that. So yes, nitrogen's been on the move. And so people wondering if they're going to have access to that. Soil testing is complicated. If they want to do it now, ammonia and urea are not detected by the test. If it's been banded, that makes fertilizer band makes it really difficult. You need many cores. You'll frustrate yourself. There's not much interpretation for taking soil tests in June other than for growing corn. Good guidelines for corn, no guidelines for other crops. We get to this stage, crop uptake has already started and it'll draw down numbers. But chief thing is organic matter starts to mineralize and it will inflate values more than it should. The standard soil test kind of takes into account mineralization, but now it is building on that. So soil testing is difficult unless someone's had a lot of experience with that. So we're suggesting that field scouting is the way to go. And nitrogen's pretty easy. It's yellowing of lower leaves, but that can also be caused by excessive wetness. Tissue tests, they'll tell you if the crop is low, but they really don't tell you how much to apply. So we're suggesting it's time to train your eye or use sensors and contrast your field versus ideally a high nitrogen check area. And oh man, we did a bunch of this in 2008 to 2010, testing sensors and things like this. Generally, your eye worked fairly well. I'm looking at my pictures, but I'm not going to show them to you here. Where we had several fields out, and you can detect a 30 to 40 bushel difference in winter wheat, no problem. But it's as differences are smaller than that, it may be helpful if you have a trained agronomist to help you in this decision. So how much to apply? If you're worried, well, it depends on if you've had high loss conditions, your rainfall, your combination of rainfall and the type of soil. If you reduced your nitrogen rates substantially in order to account for a lot of carryover, you may need to apply more. If you depended on fall nitrogen or broadcast nitrogen, those losses would be in play now. And if you still have high yield potential, when you might come back and put on low rates or no rates is if you spring applied your nitrogen, urea, ammonia, or UAN, it's probably not been lost. If you use nitrification inhibitors like Super U or Entrench or Anserve or ESN, a controlled release, that will have been a good dividend this year. They'll be protected against some of those losses. And if you're delayed planting and you expect lower yield, well, then that'll require lower nitrogen. And some of that discussion I'm having with growers now, they're saying, you know what, I'm actually putting nitrogen on at seeding, but even though I've lost some of my fall nitrogen, I'm backing off because yield potential is accordingly less. That's part of the conversation the agronomist and the grower has. In there and kick it. People, if they want to read more, they can read John Gavlowski's crop pest report.
Okay, thanks, John. And I was just wondering, as you're talking, maybe for next week, I wonder if you could have some of those pictures on the yellowing of the crop and the different color stages to look with for. I think it'd still be good timing as producers are still making decisions whether they could still apply some nitrogen if they need.
Okay, they're
That
ready
was
to go.
good information. Thanks, John. It's great. This question is for John Gavlosky, and it's coming in hot and heavy right now. John, any comment on flea beetles damage they're doing right now? The last 2 or 3 days here, we've been seeing and hearing a fair bit of flea beetles and flea beetle pressure. Any comments from your end?
Yeah, what seems to be happening is the plants are coming up, and in some cases they're really being fed on quite intensely by the flea beetles. Now, with all the later seeding, on a positive side, the seed treatments should still be effective. The seed treatments, you should get minimum 3 weeks out of them, maybe a fourth under really good conditions. And that's from the day of seeding, not when you see the crop come up. So the seed treatments should still be effective, but I have had people send me some photos and tell me that in spite of this, the population seems so heavy in some fields that even with that 1 or 2 bites per flea beetle, the plants are still getting substantial damage. What I would suggest is still use that 25% threshold. I almost hate having people spray when you have a functioning seed treatment still on there. It seems redundant, but I think in some people's mind, they want to try to get some contact kill just to knock things down so they're not doing as much defoliation. Do realize that with the products you're using, they actually work better through ingestion than they do through contact. They will work both ways. Bob Elliott in Saskatoon with Ag Canada, he did a study one year looking at mortality through ingestion, where basically he didn't hit the flea beetles, he just sprayed the plants and let flea beetles go at it, versus flea beetles that he just hit with the spray and didn't let feed on plants. He got better mortality when the flea beetles fed on the plants, but he still did get good mortality just spraying the flea beetles. So I think that's what some people are doing, even though it's within 3 weeks, the seed treatment should be working. There has been a little bit of foliar spraying, people just trying to knock the populations back.
Would the fact that there's been a fair bit of tillage and soil being black, that it seems like it's attracting them more to certain areas, or it just seems like there's so many right now?
Yeah, and I think it's just because we have canola seedlings emerging when the flea beetles are peaking. There's no evidence that tillage attracts flea beetles. What attracts flea beetles is smells, and particularly when you damage a plant, it releases a chemical called isothiocyanate, which is really attractive to flea beetles. And flea beetles also release a pheromone. It's called an attraction pheromone. And when that pheromone combines with this isothiocyanate, it's a really potent attractant. Both will attract on their own, but there's a synergistic effect. When you put these two things together, it's really attractive. So you've got small plants emerging, being fed on. You've got flea beetles starting to find it and release their pheromone, and it just makes the field more and more attractive to other flea beetles. So that's what attracts them. But again, there's no evidence that tillage or no tillage would make the field any more or less attractive. One thing that tillage might do, though, is make the microclimate a bit more favorable for flea beetles. There's been some research that showed that having some debris in the field makes for a microclimate that's a bit less attractive to flea beetles.
Okay, and I guess the other thing is there's probably hot spots in fields as well, right? So there, a guy needs to scout his whole field before making that spray decision, right?
Good point. Again, because of the way they're attracted to fields, sometimes there are edge effects, and we have had situations where people, not this year, but in previous years, I'm aware of situations where people have just done edge sprays for flea beetles because they were moving in mainly into the edge areas first, and that's where they were highest. That's where they sprayed. That can happen, especially when we have days that are in the the high teens, low 20s. They're mobile, but when we get into the mid 20s, they're even more mobile. So if it's cooler, you're more likely to have them flying shorter distances, getting an edge effect. Warmer days, they're just that much more mobile, and they may spread more evenly across the field.
Okay, and one other question is, last fall we were seeing lots of flea beetles, and is there any advantage, or would there be any advantage to maybe doing some control measures in the fall, or that's not going to make a big difference?
I think the flea beetle populations are so heavy and they're such good flyers that I wouldn't be specifically counting on making a big difference doing a late season or a fall treatment. There's been no research to suggest that would work, and my gut feeling is, yes, you'll kill a lot of flea beetles, but with the populations being very heavy, they can move around. I wouldn't want to suggest that you will have less worries the next spring. I'm not sure if that would really be true.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. That was good information for something I think we're going to be dealing with for the next couple weeks here, probably until the canola gets up and growing fast here. But we do have good growing conditions, so that's the positive, and we can get those plants growing fast. Question just came in for Kim regarding the amaranth and the redwood pigweed. That information is available, you said, or you were going to make it available?
Yeah, I can. You can email me or text me. There is an OMAF for publication on pigweed identification. It's very good. There's a lot of pictures in there by this Lynn Sosnowski, Dr. Sosnowski. She's done a ton of work, and a lot of the pictures are attributed to her. But yeah, it's a very good guide, and it's a free PDF, so you can download it, have it on your phone in iBooks or whatever. It's very good. So I can send it, or however you guys want to get it out, we can do that.
Okay, and a follow-up question is, when the seedlings are small like that, when is the best time to try to determine what the plant is? I guess thinking of grabbing samples and sending them in, when would be the best time to send them in? I guess they don't want to be sending in a bunch of pigweed samples, I guess is what they're getting at. They want to, when would be the best time to make that decision?
Honestly, it's a DNA test, so it's done off fresh tissue. So and younger plant tissue is better. So if the plants do get bigger, then always take the youngest leaves at the top. You probably could send them in at a very small stage if you did want to get an identification on them. So because it's looking for genetic markers, so those markers would be there for the life cycle of that plant. So I guess the thing is with the PSI lab, as far as I know, it's unlimited sampling. As long as you're a member of the Canola Growers Association, which means you are not asking for your checkoff money back, it is an unlimited number of samples. And one sample is 8 different plants. So I would gather, not be sending in 1 plant at a time. A sample is considered 8 plants. And if you have a way to mark where those came from in your field, where you could go back and match up plant 1, plant 2, plant 3, because we found we had a lot of mixed populations last year. What we thought was possibly smooth pigweed ended up being Powell's, and what we thought was Powell's ended up being smooth. And the water hemp and the Palmer are pretty distinctive once they get bigger. Like even once they're up to your, mid calf height, like a good 8 inches tall, they start to see the water hemp can be quite shiny. And the leaves just have a little bit of a different shape, like it's still an amaranth, but it's a little bit different, and they can be very glossy. Not always, but quite often they are. And then with Palmer, once the leaves get to be a good size, especially look at the older leaves and the petiole, which is the stem part of the leaf that attaches it to the main stem of the plant. You bend that back over the leaf, so pull the leaf off the plant and bend that petiole back, and the petiole is longer than the leaf itself. But you have to get a little bit of height on that plant to be able to see that. So when they get bigger that way, but yeah, you could send them in fairly early in the year, as long as there's enough to sample. I guess there'd have to be a big enough plant to get some sampling done on. So okay. I'm actually going to be working with PSI Lab on we're going to try to get a video on their site on how to gather the samples and how to get them to them as best as possible, because they need to arrive fresh. If they start to dry out, it's hard to get a good DNA out of them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim. One more question that came in that I'd like to get answered or commented on. This producer says, been seeding and spraying and haven't had a chance to look at my winter wheat for a while. Is there any disease issues that I should be looking at or thinking about right now? Has anybody been seeing anything showing up in winter wheat? I see David is on. David, would you want to take a stab at that? Have you heard anything or?
Sorry, Lionel, can you repeat that question? I was multitasking when you were asking.
Okay, no problem. What it is I'll do it a little briefer. Basically, he's been seeding and spraying, and he hasn't had a chance to look at his winter wheat for a couple weeks here. And he was just wondering if anybody's been reporting any disease, leaf disease, probably issues in the winter wheat right now that he should be concerned about. He says it's starting to jump.
Yeah, Lionel, I haven't yet heard reports of leaf diseases in winter wheat. I have heard from talking to Alex with Ducks Unlimited. He looks at a lot of winter wheat, that the crop actually looks pretty good, pretty vigorous. So I wouldn't be worried about foliar diseases. I would be keeping an eye open for when the crop is approaching flowering, because like all cereals, it is susceptible to fusarium head blight, maybe more so than spring wheat, because it doesn't have a lot of genetic resistance built into it. But of course, that flowering is going to happen a lot earlier than the spring crop, especially this year. Our fusarium forecast maps will be up and running by the 27th of June. That's our plan, but I'm guessing that some winter wheat crops might be heading and coming towards flowering before that. If so, you want to be aware of muggy weather, that is hot, humid weather, because those are the conditions favorable for infection. And you might want to be ready with head blight fungicide.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions today. And what we'll do is I wanted to make sure I put the CropTalk Diagnostic School that's happening this year, July 5th to the 8th. There's finding it. There's Marla Rickman's information, and I'm sure she could help you find out how to register, and probably it would be an advantage to register or pre-register, because they usually fill up, and it hasn't been running for a couple of years, so I think it's going to be well attended. So get your registrations done. We're going to be needing. Yes, go ahead, Marla.
Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to let people know, for any farmers who are on the listing right now too, we are working on a process for a Farmer Friday, and so there will be a reduced price. So if anybody is interested, they can send me an email, again, marla.rickman@gov.mb.ca, or mbcropschool@gmail.com, which is our crop diagnostic school account. So if anybody is interested, they can always fire off an email to get more information. Just wanted to put that out there. We haven't fully advertised it yet as we're in the middle of working out the finer details. But
Great. That was something that came up last week's webinar. So thanks for looking into that. And Farmer Friday sounds like a nice title. So good job there. Okay, Kim Brown, or this, if you're looking, we're going to be getting into spring season. So the field crop production guides are available at all our ag services centers. And if you're looking for bulk type orders, there would be Kim Brown's information, or you can contact any of the other ag staff. There's our contact information. There's our livestock and forage specialist contact information. So if you got questions regarding pasture, and I actually talked to a couple producers that were saying in a couple weeks time they might be looking at taking their first cut of alfalfa already. It seems to be coming on fairly hot and heavy right now. So that's good to see that we might be getting some good feed coming off. Contact information for our ag services centers are there, our 1-800 numbers, and mine and Lori's contact information. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. I'd like to thank the questions that are coming in. They're good questions and really current, so thanks for that. And see you next Crop Talk, June the 15th. Thanks for attending.